Hello students, this is Professor McDermott. The topic today, we'll continue with the story of China with a special emphasis on how Chinese culture really had an enormous influence on an emerging power in the Asian world, namely Japan, and how that happened by way of Korea. In 220 AD, the Han Dynasty ended its long period of supremacy over China, and the nation of China, the Empire of China, descended into a period of chaos and anarchy. First, it split into three kingdoms, and then no fewer than 16 squabbling kingdoms for a period of time. However, after a few centuries of disunity, a new emperor emerged named the Emperor Wendi. His reign began in the year 581. Wendi was a Buddhist, and he used Buddhist principles to reunite China and also to establish his family on the imperial throne of China as the Sui dynasty. And ever since then, Buddhists have considered the Emperor Wendi to be the model of a great Buddhist ruler. And so, during the Sui dynasty, you see the spread of Buddhism not only throughout China, but also to China's next door neighbor, namely the Korean peninsula, which at this time was divided into three separate kingdoms known as Silla, Paekchi, and Koguryo. And all three kingdoms really derived a great deal of their culture from their powerful neighbor to the west. But also, very significantly, there was a small region in southern Korea called Kaya, which was a Japanese trading outpost and really a sort of small foothold for Japan on the Korean peninsula. And that was very significant for Japan because through Kaya, Chinese thought, Chinese language, Chinese culture came to Japan and really propelled them forward into very rapid development. And that happened through Kaya on the Korean peninsula. So let's talk about Japan. And of course, in the course, we have generally looked at the creation stories from the various cultures and looked for whatever those stories could tell us about the culture and the people that we're considering. The Japanese creation story is known to us from two texts that were written down in the 8th century, known as the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. And they tell us that the two creator gods of Japan were known as Izanagi and Izanami. These were the parents, if you will, of the Japanese islands. But there is a related story in which Izanagi gave birth to another god or goddess, Amaterasu, himself, without any help from the goddess Izanami. From his left eye, we've seen this before, for example, with the tears of Khepri in Egypt giving rise to humanity. So here, once again, is a story about a male god who's doing it all himself, giving birth to the sun goddess Amaterasu without any intervention from his wife Izanami. And this sun goddess Amaterasu was very important to the Japanese as part of the Japanese Shinto religion. And in fact, her symbol, the rising sun, is, as you probably know, the emblem on the Japanese flag to this very day. Well, continuing on with this legend, so according to the myth, Amaterasu sent her grandson named Ninigi, the god Ninigi, to become the ruler of Japan. And he ruled from a mountain called Takachiho on the um, smaller island of Kyushu. But Ninigi intermarried with humans, and so he had descendants who were part human, part god. One of them was named Jimmu, and Jimmu, according to Japanese legend, was the first human ruler, although he was also part god, the first human ruler of Japan, and he made his home on the Yamato Plain in the larger island of Honshu. And this story about how the Japanese emperors are descended from the gods is very significant. There is still an emperor in Japan. As I record this lecture, his name is Akihito. His father, Hirohito, was the emperor during World War II, and because the Japanese people at that time still believed that their emperor, Hirohito, was a god or descended from gods, that partly explains why they were willing to go to such great lengths to try to win that war, including carrying out suicide missions and so forth, because they thought if it was a command from the emperor, then it must be a command from a god, and they did not want to disobey that. And you see here on the map the islands I was referring to, Japan, of course, being what we call an archipelago. That's a wonderful word. An archipelago is just a chain of islands off the coast of Asia there, obviously. You see the smaller islands, Shikoku, Hokkaido, and Kyushu, and the larger island of Honshu. But there are many, many other islands that belong to Japan that are not included on this map. Well, so if we believe the legend, then at some point leadership in this emerging Japanese nation shifted from the island of Kyushu over to the island of Honshu. And it's there that we have the first archaeological records that show this new civilization making progress in what's called the Yayoi culture, which dates to about 300 BC. And it's from this period that archaeologists have found the first evidence of extensive cultivation of rice in Japan. Of course, rice being the staple food of Japanese people, along with fish, probably why they're some of the healthiest and long-lived people in the world, because their diet is really so light and so sensible. It was during this period of the Yayoi culture that Japan was propelled simultaneously into the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, as tools and weapons made of those metals arrived in Japan at the same time. And once again, from China. As always, we see this massive influence of China on early Japan. Although, of course, Japan would later become a great superpower in its own right. What we call the Yamato Kingdom emerges between 250 to 350 AD in Japan, on the island of Honshu, and we get the evidence here of great advances in terms of material culture, wealth, and prosperity, with numerous objects that were buried in large burial mounds that are characteristic of this period, similar to the Indian burial mounds that we have in this country. By the 5th century AD, the Yamato kingdom had continued to get stronger and stronger, and again, this was largely due to imports from the mainland from Korea, Korean horses, for example, but also iron technology and silk cultivation coming from China by way of Korea. And so Japan continued to grow stronger and to grow more advanced. The first emperor that we have any actual historical records for, the Japanese believe to have been the 15th emperor of their nation, the Emperor Ojin, who rules around 400 AD. There's an interesting myth about his mother, Jingu. It's said that she must have been a very tough lady. Supposedly, she launched an invasion of Korea when she was 9 months pregnant with the Emperor Ojin, and it is said that she tied a rock between her thighs in order to prevent the Emperor Ojin from being born while she was on this military campaign, which she was determined to win. Well, obviously that's a legend, but perhaps tells us something about the Japanese in this period and their emerging sense of power and strength. Um, and that power and strength developed in contact with China. The Emperor Ojin and his successors launched numerous missions to the Chinese court and courts in different eras to try to get goods, to get new technology, to get know-how and ideas, so that they could continue to develop their own strength. And so the power of the emperors grows, but as always in Japan, the emperor was not the only power in the government. In Japan, the nobility, the feudal lords, with noble titles, as we've seen before in different periods of Chinese history, these feudal lords also had tremendous power in the Japanese system. And the lords and the ladies were divided into clans, different families, and different clans took on different roles in the life of the emperor's court, sometimes very significant roles. So, for example, the Soga clan was in charge of stewardship of all the emperor's lands, all the lands owned by the emperor. And so they gained great power and prestige by carrying out this function. There were other groups known as Bei and Tomo that also carried out other special functions like collecting taxes, recruiting people into the military, and so forth. And so it wasn't as if the Emperor of Japan was a one-man show. There was always a hierarchy of people beneath the Emperor who were helping him out with the various tasks that needed to be done. Alright, so traditional Japanese religion is known as Shinto. Shinto is a somewhat primitive religion that is based on the worship of gods known as kami. These are local gods, gods of towns like the Greeks had, for example, or the Mesopotamians, local gods for different towns and cities. Also, all of the ancestors of the imperial Yamato family were considered to be kami, and so people would pray to them as well. Shinto, in its original form, really didn't have much moral or ethical teaching. It's the sort of religion that revolves around fears of impurity and contamination. So there are certain things you can do that would make you ritually impure so that you would not be allowed to carry out the rituals of the Shinto religion. And if that happened to you, then you had to go to a Shinto priest and get purified before you could take part. We've seen this to some extent with Hinduism, for example. And also Judaism. Judaism has rules like this as well. But the Shinto religion, Japanese religion, underwent a major change starting in the mid-6th century AD when, from Korea, the first Buddhist monks immigrate to Japan from the Paekchi Kingdom in Korea, come over to the Japanese islands, and start to spread this new teaching among the Japanese. And fortunately for these Buddhist missionaries, that very powerful clan, the Soga clan, became Buddhist and really helped to get the Buddhist teachings a hearing, and eventually, helped many Japanese to adopt Buddhist principles. They even were able to get a pro-Buddhist emperor installed on the Japanese throne in the year 587 AD. Of all the members of the Soga clan, though, the one who did the most to spread Buddhist teaching was a man named Prince Shotoku. It's Shotoku, really, who's chiefly responsible for getting Buddhism accepted in Japan. And you see in the statue here that Prince Shotoku by Buddhists then was considered to be a bodhisattva, one of those powerful beings, spiritual beings, who after their death stays on earth to try to spread Buddhism and help people to get to nirvana. He is revered as a bodhisattva, which shows how much he really did to help Buddhism in Japan. It's interesting, though, that although Shotoku was interested in Buddhism, very much Mahayana type of Buddhism, he was also very knowledgeable about Confucian teachings and also promoted those. And so really what you see emerging here is a synthesis of Shinto, Buddhism, and Confucianism. We see that reflected in a very important document called the 17-Article Constitution, which appeared in the year 604. That was produced through the influence primarily of Prince Shotoku. And you see the Confucianism coming forth in this document in phrases like harmony is to be valued, and the idea that the whole society needs to be very orderly, very traditional, very hierarchical. So the Constitution brings Buddhist and Confucian ideas into the Japanese government. But it's very interesting that Japan has always managed to include or import ideas from other countries and to make use of them as it wanted to make use of them without letting those ideas come in and actually take over. And that's especially true in terms of religious ideas. So, for example, later in the 16th century, the Portuguese would visit Japan and they would bring Christianity to Japan. And for a while, there were actually hundreds of thousands of Japanese Christians who had been converted by the Portuguese. But the Japanese government really did not want to let this foreign religion take over their country, and so they put a stop to that by persecuting these 16th century Christians. There is a very interesting movie that came out in the year 2017 called Silence, directed by Martin Scorsese, that depicts this persecution. The Japanese government really didn't persecute Buddhists in the 6th and 7th century, but they did make sure that the Buddhist monasteries especially came under government control. And so the government played a role in telling the Buddhist monks what they could and could not say and do. And so the Japanese government managed to use Buddhism, in a sense, to build up their own strength without letting Buddhism undermine their agenda. So in political terms, maybe not in religious terms, but in political terms, this was a very successful strategy for Japan. And what emerges from this is a new type of Buddhism called Vairocana Buddhism that was perfectly adapted to Japanese culture and Japanese needs. Essentially, Vairocana Buddhism is a combination or synthesis of Mahayana Buddhism with Shinto, the ancient Japanese religious tradition. So, the Shinto gods, the kami, in this new Vairocana Buddhism become bodhisattvas, so they can be worshipped and honored. They can continue to be worshipped and honored just as they were in Shinto, even within the context of this new Buddhist religion. And over in the illustration there, you see a very typical illustration from the Vairocana tradition. You see the Buddha there in the middle. He is the center of everything, but all around him there are all these other powerful spiritual beings, the kami, who have become bodhisattvas in this new system of belief. So the Japanese successfully adapted Buddhism to suit their own needs, and that illustration in a way is a perfect example of how the Japanese government worked. You can imagine the emperor sitting at the center there, and he was the center of everything, but the lords, who did many things for the emperor all around him, were also incredibly important. And in fact, over much of Japanese history, the emperor actually became a sort of figurehead without a great deal of real power. A new clan emerged called the Fujiwara clan that for centuries actually held the real power in Japan with the title of regent, which we've seen before. So, in a sense, you have this idea that the emperor is a god and he's kind of above politics, but the real dirty work of politics is being carried out by the nobles, the lords beneath him, and especially these regents from the Fujiwara clan. Very typical Japanese approach. All right, well, let's go back over to China. Um, the Sui dynasty fell and was replaced by the Tang dynasty in 618 AD. And we get a sense of the Tang approach from the acts of the Emperor Taizong, who ruled from 626 to 649 AD. And with Taizong, you see, again, that gift, it seems to be an Asian gift of synthesizing, of taking different traditions and kind of piecing them together to make some new system that combines all the good qualities of the old ones. Europeans, I think, are not nearly as good at this as Asians are. Taizong was very interested in Buddhism, and he supported Buddhism in a number of ways. But the law code that he issued includes not only Buddhist ideas, but legalist and Confucianist ideas from earlier in Chinese history. So it's a masterful synthesis of those three systems of thought. The Emperor Taizong did make one major mistake towards the end of his life. His oldest son and his heir to the throne was having a homosexual relationship with another man, and the Emperor Taizong considered this to be very shameful, and so he actually had his son murdered, and that meant that another son, the future Emperor Tang Gaozong, became the heir to the throne and succeeded to the imperial throne upon the death of his father in 649 AD. But I say this was a mistake because the Emperor Tang Gaozong was actually a very weak emperor who was completely dominated and controlled by his very shrewd, very ambitious, very powerful wife, who originally had just been his concubine or mistress, but she was so gifted that she was able to get herself the status of a wife, and then later the empress. We call her the Empress Wu, not to be confused with the Han Dynasty Emperor Wu. But Empress Wu, in her own way, was nearly as powerful as that Emperor Wu that we've already learned about, who had done so much for China. In 683, Tang Gaozong died, and the Empress Wu managed to seize control of China in her own right and have herself proclaimed the empress and ruler of that nation. One of the very few times in Chinese history when a woman was able to rule. She had the intention of founding a new dynasty called the Zhao dynasty, and this became her obsession, and she would not allow any opposition to her plans. She was very ruthless with her political enemies. Her typical mode of getting rid of her enemies was to have them dragged out into the public square in front of the palace and then have their arms and legs cut off one by one, after which they would bleed to death in public in full sight of the people. And this, you can imagine, was a strong deterrent to anyone who might dare to oppose the Empress Wu. So she was a pretty tough old gal. She also created a secret police force to spy on and root out her enemies so that she could subject them to this sort of treatment. In spite of her cruelty, the Empress Wu was known actually as a devoted Buddhist, although I'm not sure what the Buddha would have thought of her. One of the things she did as a Buddhist was to have a sexual affair with an abbot of a Buddhist monastery. That's the leader of a monastery, an abbot. And he promoted devotion to her as a goddess under the title Heavenly Lady, Pure and Radiant. So actually, in a way, the worship of the Empress Wu eventually became part of Chinese Buddhism, thanks to this abbot who was her lover. But the Empress Wu was not able, in spite of her best efforts, to prove her toughness as a woman. In the end, was not able to hang on to complete control, um, be- because I think largely of her tyrannical ways. Um, the surviving members of the Tang dynasty were able to reassert themselves in 705 AD, overthrow the Empress Wu, and reestablish control. And they would continue their rule over China until the year 907 AD. But the Empress Wu is a fascinating figure, one of those rare women who, through a combination of intelligence and good luck and ruthlessness, was able, at least for a time, to assert female power in this very male-dominated society.